the characters on the show, like one's a werewolf, a vampire, and a ghost, and the way they come off with, you know, these sort of afflictions, it feels very much like someone with a terminal illness, or an addiction, or disease. Was that very deliberate on your part?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you know anything about the development process of the show was incredibly circuitous and quite frustrating at times. It started off as I was approached by Touch Paper, it's an independent TV company in the UK, and they wanted to develop a show about a group of people who have bought a house together. And they approached me, and that was it. And they approached me with this idea, and I thought that's the dullest idea I've ever heard. But completely unbidden, I had these ideas for 3 characters, and they were at the time humans. And so I developed these characters, and the way I normally work is that I'll write biogs for the characters, and I wrote pages and pages of bios. And Mitchell at the time was a recovering sex addict. Annie was agoraphobic, and George was this guy who compartmentalised every aspect of his life and had kind of severe anger issues. But they were still very much human. We developed this, developed it on the basis of this for a while, but we're getting absolutely nowhere with it. And we decided to have one last meeting, and if nothing came of that, we were going to give it up. And in the meantime, I'd been, purely for my own benefit, been developing just an idea of my own about a romantic comedy about a werewolf. And we were looking at the characters we had in this show, and I suddenly saw a correlation between George in this show and the werewolf in the thing I was developing. And because this one was going nowhere, I said, well, you know what we could do is we could turn George into a werewolf. And then after that, it seemed like a very kind of natural progression that, well, if he's a werewolf, then actually the sort of crisis that Mitchell is going through is not dissimilar to a vampire renouncing blood. And Annie, being agoraphobic and rooted to this house, is very much like a ghost haunting the house. And so the supernatural aspects were added on after the fact, so to speak. But consequently, it meant that the bedrock was the humans were that the bedrock was character, as opposed to having started from the point of view of creating a supernatural show. We started from creating a character-led drama, and consequently, then when we've been writing the series and developing the series, we always try and find what human analogy to make the to give the supernatural stories texture. We try and find out what the kind of human equivalent is. For example, like in episode 2, when Tully, the other werewolf, comes along, and because often we find is when you find the human analogy, it completely unlocks the story. And so, like with Tully, we had this thing about, there was this guy going to be staying in the house, and I didn't really know what we were going to do with him there. And then it suddenly occurred to me that, well, he's just the flatmate from hell. He's the mate of the guy who you meet at the pub, and he said, oh, can I stay for one night? And he stays for one night, and he ends up staying for weeks, and then, and we were kind of thinking, well, what does that, we all know that guy. What does he do? Well, he eats all the food, and he stinks out the bathroom, and he makes a pass at the girl in the house. And as soon as we'd realised that that was actually the story we were telling, it completely unlocked it. And similarly with Mitchell, it is essentially a drug addiction that he's kind of struggling with. And it's something that becomes, and with George, for example, it is like somebody who has a contagious illness, like HIV or something, and their absolute worst nightmare is the idea of passing it on. And George refers to it as a curse and so on. So yeah, it's always a question of finding what the human analogy is to unlock the stories.
Why was there such a change between episode 0 and episode 1, and why did it take a year?
It's it's a very long answer. Basically, because BBC Three, I'd written the pilot episode, a pilot script, which was never intended to be a pilot. It was going to be episode 1 of the series, and then BBC Three decided they were going to do a series of pilots. Now, we never do pilots in the UK, and consequently, I don't think we quite understood how to do them. So we did the pilots, and before the pilots went out, a decision was made that we were going to, the BBC was actually not going to commission Being Human, it was going to commission a different show. So we were all feeling a bit deflated about that, but the pilots were broadcast anyway, because which I think is absolutely fair enough. Because the way that the BBC is funded, it comes from public money. It's not private money. So consequently, everything the BBC makes, it's the public's right to then see it. So the pilots were broadcast, and suddenly Being Human got this extraordinary reaction that we were absolutely completely unprepared for, and it took on a life of its own. And so suddenly this reaction was spreading, and it also, I think what was interesting was that it was happening through the internet, and again, thank you. And again, that's something that had never happened before, and suddenly there was this audience that I think the BBC, like most channels, had been trying to capture and trying to find for a long time, and suddenly there they were, invested in the show. And so there was an online petition, and then the BBC were being lobbied with letters and emails from the public, asking for them to turn it into a series. By change, do you mean like the casting change?
The casting changed, and the tone, it was a little darker.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that by the time when the BBC had seen the response that it had got, they decided to commission a series. The thing is, by that point, the options on the actors had run out. So Andrea Riseborough, who played Annie in the pilot, she's somebody whose star is very much on the ascendant, and so she just went off and was off. In the moment the option ran out, she was offered 20 jobs, so we lost her. But interestingly, even though the pilot system was very frustrating, it gave us an opportunity to rethink certain aspects of it. And one thing we felt that we got tonally wrong in the pilot were the vampires, because in every other aspect we'd strived, and I think to a degree we're quite successful in making it very believable, in as much as and very kind of human and familiar, despite the kind of heightened nature of the characters. And the one thing we felt we hadn't got right were the vampires. It's like they were from a different show. It was very kind of, it was Anne Rice. It was all, it's all kind of, and red waistcoats and things like that. And we all kind of looked and thought, this is. And so consequently, when we got the series, it gave us an opportunity to look at that again. And so we decided we wanted to take the vampires in a completely different direction, and to make them kind of, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but to make them as mundane as everything else in a way, to make it as familiar and workaday as everything else was. And so we came up with this idea of giving Herrick this hinterland, because everyone else in the show, like Mitchell and George, have their kind of secret identities, and so we decided to use that for Herrick. And again, that kind of suddenly that opened it up, and it made it more. I think in a way it made it more kind of chilling, the fact that the vampires were operating within society and were essentially kind of invisible, because they were they looked completely normal and so on. So in that sense, the pilot gave us the opportunity to look at those bits again.
So we watched them back to back. We watched 0 through 4 all at once, then we watched 5, and then we watched 6. So it was a little bit of a shock to watch that one, and then all of a sudden it changed, and I was unaware. I was like, well, what happened? What happened to my friends that were just in that episode? So it was a bit of a shock for me. He's like, get over it and, move on. And by the second episode, I was okay. Mm-hmm. But we watched them all together, so.
No, but this was the thing, because the reaction to the pilot had been so extraordinary and so positive and incredibly gratifying. Consequently, I think people felt, understandably, that they had an investment in the show. They were kind of like shareholders in a way, because they'd all campaigned to get the show commissioned, they'd all signed a petition, they'd all written to the BBC, and so suddenly when it was announced that yes, it's coming back, but we've changed the cast, the reaction was quite extreme, and in the way that only sci-fi fans can get. And so suddenly there were people who had campaigned to get the show made were now saying, well, I'm not going to watch it now, I hate it, I loathe the show.